Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Live from Currituck Extension. My name is Adam Fromella. I'm the county's agriculture extension agent. And on today's episode, we're going to go through a guide to backyard peaches. And this is a presentation I made from a collection of resources from NC State University. The link to those are in the description, and I'll go over those today for this presentation. If you're watching this live, shoot me questions in the chat, and I'll answer them along the way. If you've watched any of the presentations on blueberries or strawberries, this is going to follow that format. So I'll stop for questions along the way. If you're watching this recorded, you can shoot me an email, and my email is on our website. So you'll find that in the link to the description again. Also in the description, we've got our social media links. So check out those because we're very active on those sites. And check out our evaluation. It's got a number of questions that help us know if you like what we're doing, if we're doing a good job, and we take suggestions as well. So check that out if you have some time. But we're going to go ahead and get started with our backyard guide to peaches. And peaches are something that I think a lot of people enjoy in the summertime, and maybe some people have thought about growing them. They can be quite difficult, but hopefully today, what you'll take from this presentation is that it's something that most people can do with just a little bit of knowledge. So for overview, we're going to go through our site and cultivar selection, finding the best place to put your peach trees, how to plant them properly. Really the goal is to reduce stress on your peaches. And so we'll go through that with planting, maintenance, and then we'll finish with disease control. In previous presentations, I talked about insect control at the end, but I think diseases are more of an issue on peaches than insects. So we'll go through those at the end. Of course, I'll stop along the way for questions. So if you have any, type them down in the chat, whether you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, we'll be able to answer those. So we're going to start with site and cultivar selection. So when we're talking about sites for peaches, they really require two things. The first is good soil that drains properly. And what I mean by that is soil that isn't sitting in water. Peaches like areas that are dry relatively. They don't like to have their roots wet. So the way you can tell this is if you just dig a hole about 2 feet deep, kind of like a post hole that they have in the picture there, and see if it fills up with water. And really, this week would be a great time to do that because we're going to get some rain. So see, does it drain in 24 to 48 hours? If it does, then it's a great spot for peaches. If not, you might want to consider amending your soil, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. The other thing that they need is full sunlight. So your fruit trees need a lot of light, and that's because the peaches require light to get the energy to produce peaches. So a lot of our fruits need full sunlight. Now, you can get away with planting peaches in areas with less sunlight, but again, you're going to add stress to your plant when you do that. And so with peaches, it's important to limit stress as much as we can. When our plants are stressed, they're more likely to get diseases, to be attacked by insects. I like to think about it like how when we're really stressed in the winter time with cold weather or bad weather, you're more likely to get the cold or the flu, things like that. Plants are the same way. If you stress them a lot, they're more likely to get diseases. So site selection is really important to reduce the stress on our plants. The next thing is cultivar selection, and this is from one of our resources on our small fruit production guide, and it's just choosing the appropriate type of peaches for our area. And so we've got a list of them here. You might not find these if you go to a box store like Lowe's or Home Depot or Walmart, something like that. But this is what you should be looking for if you have the option. The main thing to look out for is peaches with guardian rootstock, and that's roots for the plant that are resistant to short life syndrome, which is where peaches will die in about 3 to 5 years. That's something that happens a lot in this area on sandy soils. So you want to make sure if you have grown peaches before and you haven't had much success, this could be a reason why. You should be able to find these cultivars if you look at any fruiting magazines that sell fruit trees or on websites that specifically sell fruit trees. As far as differences between peaches, you have yellow peaches and white peaches. A lot of people don't like white peaches, but I think it's just because the ones you get at the store usually aren't very good. But I think white peaches are pretty good compared to yellow peaches. Again, it's a preference thing. And then there's free pit, which is where the pits come out, and then there's other peaches where the pits don't come out as easily. So those are really your differences in peaches. You don't need a bunch because they're self-fertile or self-fruitful, so they'll fruit with only one variety. But I usually plant 2 or 3 trees if you can, And of course, mixing varieties will help, but it's not required. So those are your cultivar selection. Another thing to think about when you're selecting your trees is the size. They get about 15 to 20 feet. That's the standard size for a peach. And this picture here aren't peaches, these are apples. I know that, but it's a good demonstration. Your standards are about 15 to 20 feet tall. Your dwarf, on the other hand, are about 6 to 8 feet tall, which is a little bit more manageable for most people. And then a semi-dwarf is somewhere in between. With peaches, though, I think it doesn't matter quite as much because you can prune them to really the size that you want. So a mature peach tree that has been pruned, while it might be 15 feet tall, the peaches aren't going to be quite that high, and they're pretty accessible, pretty easy to get to those peaches. So that's one thing to consider. If you're planting a dwarf, you can expect to have less peaches because you have less tree. So it's less area for those peaches. But a lot of this depends on your area. Maybe a dwarf tree fits better in your landscape. So all of those things are important to consider when you're choosing the right site and the right cultivar. That way you don't have quite as stressed trees. So that's pretty easy introduction to getting started with peaches. If you have any questions, type them down in the chat now or shoot me an email. Again, that's on our website. But if not, we're going to go into planting. And I don't see anybody having any questions right now. But like I said, we're going to stop periodically. So if you think of something as we go along, feel free to type it down in the chat. With that, we're going to go into planting, which is another crucial part to making your plants as less stressed as possible. Now, when you want to plant your plants, the best time is going to be in January or February in the cooler months. And the reason is the trees aren't going to have their leaves there. So the only part that's growing is the roots. And that's really important when you're establishing trees because during the fruiting season, when they have leaves, they're spending a lot of energy on the above ground portion of the plant. And that's great when you want to make peaches. But when you're establishing your plant, you want those roots to grow. That way you'll have a healthy tree. And so planting in the winter is the best. Before you plant, you should take soil samples. And this is kind of a picture of what that looks like. We have soil sample boxes and a form, and we've got videos on how to do that on our YouTube channel, so you can check those out. But basically, you'll be taking samples. They're free from April through Thanksgiving. And so you'll dig about 3 to 5 inches deep in the soil. Usually we take tiny little samples about the size of a quarter with a special tool, but you can use a shovel. And you'll remove the top inch or so that usually has grass and leaves, and that'll throw off the sample. So you remove that, take the bottom 4 inches or so, and then you'll mix it together in a bucket, put it in a box, and we'll ship it off. The one thing is you want to make sure that that soil is dry before you ship it off. But when you do that, it'll tell you how much nutrients you have to add to your soil for your peaches and what the pH is or how acidic or basic the soil is. And again, these are things that you want to do to give your peach the best environment so it's not stressed. And that's really important when we start to talk about diseases. But this is something that should be done. Like I said, it's free from April through Thanksgiving. So October or November is a great time because then you have the opportunity to get those results back. You can put down your fertilizer, your lime, or whatever you need to do to treat your soil. They'll tell you exactly how much to put down, and then you're ready to plant sometime in January and February. Now, when you're planting, you're going to be digging holes, and the holes are going to be about twice the size of the plant, twice the size of the bucket, whether that's width and depth. And that allows your plant room for its roots to grow. So if you just dig a hole the size of the bucket, that area around that hole might be compact. And so then those roots have a hard time growing into that soil. And I had that issue here at my house when I moved in. The previous homeowners planted a bunch of apple trees, but they didn't dig out the hole. And so the apple trees went in the ground. The roots didn't grow into that. They grew around where that bucket originally was. And I was able to pull those trees out by hand. So you want to make sure that you dig the hole twice the size, whether that's twice the width and the depth of the plant. And then you're going to amend your soil. And this is where we talk about fixing your issues if you have poor drainage. So what you want to do if you have a heavy clay soil like I do is you'll add something like sand or peat moss or topsoil. That makes a nice loose texture rather than the kind of clumpiness that you get with clay. If you have a sandy soil, which is common in our area, you can add some topsoil, and that'll help to make it a little bit more firm. So your plant, so that soil doesn't move away from the roots and things like that. But you'll want to do that, and then you'll put your plant in that hole, you want to make sure that you break up the roots around that plant so it's nice and fine so it can grow into that. When you bury it, you want to bury it down to the crown or the graft. And the graft is the area where the roots have been added to the trunk of the tree. It happens a lot with apples. We'll see that they graft a root with a different type of apple to the trunk. But you want to make sure that that's where you're burying it. It's usually around where the soil level was anyways. So if it comes in a pot, you want to bury it just about an inch or so, maybe deeper than it was already buried. And then you want to water it. Watering is probably the most important part. You don't want those roots to get dry. That's a quick way to kill the plants. So you want to make sure that they stay moist. And you'll water it probably every other day, depending on how much rain you get. But that's the key to planting. The better job you do up front, the less work you'll have to do later with disease control. And here's an image of what I wanted to show you when we're dealing with low-lying areas. One thing that you can do is mound your soil. And I talked about this before when we were talking about planting blueberries. So you can check out that video and a number of our videos on planting blueberries. We've got some actual footage of us planting on mounds. But the goal is to raise up that soil level. So you'll still be digging a hole. It'll be a little bit larger than twice the width and twice the depth. And that's because you're going to amend that soil. You'll mix in something, whether it's topsoil or peat moss, so you get a good texture. And then you're going to raise it up probably about 4 to 6 inches, depending on how low that area is. And then you plant your plant in that area. And again, the goal is to make sure that those roots aren't sitting in water. That's another way to kill your plants pretty quickly. So those are planting your peaches. It's kind of something that once you planted a number of plants properly, it's pretty easy. But again, it's something that's critical. If you're not doing it properly, that'll add stress to your plant. So if you have any questions, we're going to take a quick break before we get on to maintenance. And this is probably the most important part of the presentation. So if you haven't been paying attention, now is the time to start. But it looks like we do have a question. I'll see if I can put it up on our footage. So it says, how long does it take to get soil samples back? And some of that depends. So the time period that you have to pay is from Thanksgiving through March. That time you have to pay because they get a lot of samples. And so that can take anywhere between a month to 2 months to get your results back. So you really don't want to wait for that time period. During the free time period, it's usually around 2 weeks to a month long. But if you're having issues, maybe it's taking a long time, you can give us a call and we'll be able to look up and tell you exactly how long it's going to take to get your samples back. But plan for about 2 to 4 weeks to get your soil sample results back. So we don't have any more questions, so we're going to move on to maintenance now. And like I said, this is probably the most important part of your peaches. The first thing with maintenance is mulching. A lot of people, some people mulch their plants because they like the way it looks. Other people like it because it gets rid of weeds. Some people don't like to mulch, and really that's fine. But for peaches, I suggest mulching because it does 2 things. It keeps down your weeds, which is really important because weeds are a habitat for insects, for diseases, and small rodents that can damage your trees. But they also take a little bit of nutrients from your plant. But they also help to keep in moisture for your plant. And that's really important when we get into the drier months, into July, August, that time of year. It's important to keep moisture around your tree, especially around the roots. So to properly mulch your plant, you don't want it to look like a volcano. A lot of people, you'll see this, who they don't think about mulching or they don't know a lot about plants. They'll add mulch all the way up around the plant. It kind of chokes out the plant. The mulch is really hot, so it can burn the plant. So you don't want mulch all the way around the trunk. What you want it to look like is more of like a donut shape. That's how they describe it in this image, where it's nice and even around the plant, but not right around the trunk. And that's the best way to mulch. Again, it keeps in moisture, keeps out weeds, that kind of thing. And I know maybe some of you are thinking, well, what about in areas that are low-lying? Should we mulch if we've mounded our plants? And yes, you should mulch because, like I said, it keeps down weeds. But really, the reason you're mounding is to get those roots out of the water, but they still need that water. And so the mulch kind of helps them to keep water, just if it rains a couple inches, that mound is still going to allow that water to drain off. But if you get a couple tenths of an inch, that mulch will help to keep that moisture around those roots. And so it's kind of a fine balance between the two, but I always recommend mulching around your trees. If nothing else, keeping down the weeds is really important. The next thing is fertilizing. And so we talked about soil samples. That's fertilizing that you should do before planting. But after you plant, you still need to fertilize, usually not within your first year. The reason is that fertilizer, they're usually salts, and so they can burn up young plants. They can damage their roots. But after that, for the first year after 1 year that they've been in the ground, they're considered non-bearing trees. You're going to fertilize twice a year. And so that's going to be in early May and then in mid-July. And you do it 2 times a year to kind of stretch out those nutrients for your plant. Now, you don't want to do it any later than mid-July because you want all that growth to happen in the summer. If you fertilize in, say, September, the plant's really not taking up those nutrients till October or November, and you don't want your plant growing when it's supposed to be going into dormancy. So it's going to shed its leaves that time of year. So you want to make sure that it's following the proper life cycle. So early May and mid-July work. Ideally, you'd be taking soil samples, so it'll tell you exactly what nutrients you need. But if not, you can just use a handful of a granular fertilizer, something like 10-10-10 works fine. And then you want to apply it to the root area of the plant. And that's going to be the distance from the canopy. So that's the distance from where the trunk of the plant is all the way to where the branches go. And so usually with trees, it goes a little bit further too. So the example I always use is if your tree has a canopy that's, say, 10 feet from the trunk, then the roots are going to go 10 feet plus half that distance. So 10 feet plus 5 feet, the roots are going 15 feet from the trunk. And that's where you want to apply the fertilizer, in a band around that area. So that's fertilizer for non-bearing trees. Those are trees year 1 to 3. Really, year 1 to 3, you want all of that tree's production to go into the roots. So in the winter months, it's doing a lot of root growth. And then in the spring, you want to be growing the trunk and the branches so you get a nice sturdy tree that will be able to tolerate a lot of peaches. For your fruiting trees, which is years 3 pretty much throughout the rest of its life, you're going to fertilize twice. The first time is between bloom and petal fall. And I have what that looks like in the next slide, but it's basically what it seems like when the trees are flowering and then once those flowers have fallen off. And then you're going to fertilize after harvest. And so that's really when the plant has time to recoup from all of its energy that it spent producing peaches. And so that's going to be sometime in July or August. So here's the pictures of bloom and petal fall. Bloom, like it sounds like, when the plants are flowering, and then petal fall, the petals have fallen off. That's a crucial time because all that fertilizer is going to go into producing the peaches themselves. So it's a really important time to add your fertilizer. Again, you want to do soil samples if you can. If you don't do soil samples, you can add a little bit of fertilizer. A generic like 10-10-10 will work fine, but you don't need a lot. And then you'll want to add a little bit of water to make sure that it mixes into the soil. The last thing is probably the most important thing when we're talking about peaches, and that's getting the proper shape by pruning. Pruning is really critical for trees because it allows airflow into the trees. It allows light to penetrate the trees. And with peaches, that's super important because peaches are really prone to diseases, whether that's diseases on the leaves or on the peaches themselves. And so we get through that with pruning. I'm not going to talk a lot about the different times to prune because it varies from year to year depending on how old your tree is. But I've got a link in the description that has a number of great videos on how to prune properly. And that was done from our fruit extension specialist. And so he'll go over pruning at planting, early trees, which are basically to year 3 or 4, and then more mature trees. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the general shape today. So this image here is good because it shows kind of an early peach planting. So what you'd expect to see from somebody who went to the store and bought a peach tree and then put it in the ground. So on the first side, what you'll see is what we call a whip. And that's a really young tree that's mostly just a stem, maybe has a couple branches. And put it in the ground. And then what you want to do is prune the plant. So you're removing that top part, or the actual whip, the initial stem, because peaches are supposed to have what's called an open base system. It's kind of like an umbrella, or the way I like to look at it is like a turkey or a chicken foot that's kind of spread out like that. That's how you want your peach tree to look if you're looking straight down at the tree. And so if you remove that top part of the tree, it'll allow it to produce branches out laterally, kind of like that chicken foot. And that's what you want for peaches. Those are called your scaffold branches because it's basically the fortification or the scaffold for your tree where all the peaches are going to grow. So you do that. You'll remove your lower branches. You only want to keep about 3 to 5 of the scaffold branches. And then that middle image there is what it should look like after 1 year of growth. So you have all those 3 scaffold branches, and your tree is on the way to becoming a good fruiting tree. Now, the last 2 pictures show what kind of pruning should be done after the first year. And really, the general rule is to remove all branches that are growing straight up and straight down. And that's because the branches that are growing straight up aren't going to have enough strength to support peaches, but also they're going to shade the rest of the tree. And the branches that are growing straight down are going to be shaded by the rest of the tree. So you want to get rid of those as well. And then there's some different things that you have to do depending on the year, how old the tree is. So after about 2 years of growth, you'll do a heading cut, which is where you remove the tips of the branches. That'll make them fork. And there's, like I said, a lot of great videos on that. But pruning is something that's really important for peaches. The key is to get the right shape. But also when you're pruning, don't think of it quite like a science, like, oh, I don't know if this is the right cut. I don't know. I'm scared to take risks, because really the tree will take care of itself. Just make sure that you're actually out there pruning and doing the best that you can. And those videos will help. The one thing that I didn't mention is that you want to be pruning in January or February, particularly earlier in the year if you can. And that's because when you prune the tree, it stresses them and they produce pheromone. And if you do it in the winter months, then there's no insects to kind of smell or sense that pheromone and attack the tree. And it also gives the tree time to heal before it's putting on peaches. So you want to prune in January to February. So that was a lot of information. If you have to, go back and watch this section if you're pruning peaches or you're planning on pruning peaches. And like I said, check out the link in the description. The last thing for peaches is thinning. It's really important because if you have a section of peaches, a branch section that's about 3 foot long, you'll have probably about 30 peaches on that section, which is way too many peaches. If you've ever grown peaches before or know somebody who has and they said, well, my peaches only get about the size of a golf ball, or a lot of them fall off, that's the reason why. They're not thinning properly. So the goal should be to have one fruit about every 6 to 8 inches. And in the image here, you see the person putting out their fingers. That's a good rule. It's usually about 6 to 8 inches. So you want to remove all the peaches in between that area there. And you'll be doing that when the peaches are about the size of a nickel up to a quarter. And that gives the plant plenty of time to put nutrients into just those peaches left. Now, this is going to seem kind of odd because, like I said, the section that's 3 feet long might have 30 peaches, and then you're going to remove it down to about 5. But those peaches that you have will be getting bigger, and they're more likely to stay on the plant because they're not being overcrowded. So thinning is a crucial part of maintenance that's going to happen pretty early in the year, probably by April, maybe even into May, depending on what type of peach plant you have. But with that, that's all we have for maintenance. If you have any questions, add them to the chat or shoot me an email if you're watching it on YouTube. Looks like we do have a question. And it says, I lost half of my limbs on my peach tree. The peaches are growing good on the other branches, but some of them are dead. Do you know what could be the cause? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the upcoming slides. There are some insects that could cause that. Other issues, depending on how the peach was pruned. If the peaches aren't pruned with the branches at the correct angle, when they get any weight, they might split. So there are some things like that. There's also some diseases that might damage the ends of the branches. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those things in the next slide. But if none of these things sound right, you can shoot me an email and send me some pictures and I'll try to help you. But with that, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So we're going to move on to the last section, which is disease control. And this is something that is hopefully not going to be an issue for you if you do proper maintenance, you fertilize properly, you did a good job planting, that sort of thing. With that being said, some of these diseases just kind of come by. And so we'll show you some of the things to look out for in your peaches. So this is the first resource that I have. This is for home orchards, and it's diseases and insects. It was made by NC State University. I really like this because a lot of the things out there that they say, well, treat it with this, you might not be able to find those products, but this publication is really good because you should be able to find all these products at a box store or online if you need to treat your peaches, and it has pictures of the diseases. So this is the first disease that you might see. It's called leaf curl. And just like the name suggests, the leaves start to curl. They turn kind of this red-orange color, and they're really kind of an odd coloration, odd malformed leaf. Now, this is something that you'll probably start to notice in the spring and summer, and there's not much you can do once you notice it for that year. The leaves will fall off in the fall, sometime in October, November, December. And then you can start your treatments, and they can be controlled with Bordeaux mixture, coppers, or lime and sulfur sprays. And I've got some of those products here that I got for our orchard at our office. And so you can find these things at your box stores. Just make sure that you read the label, which is going to be on the back, and usually just peel them off. And that'll tell you if you can apply it for leaf curl, if you can apply it on peaches. But you can get these products. So like I said, these are from that publication from NC State. So you should be able to find these things out there. Now, when you want to apply these for leaf curl, it's going to be in winter before bud swell. So before those buds have started to get bigger, it's going to be probably January. So if you notice you had leaf curl the previous year, you can spray one of these, and it should be a one and done thing. You spray it in the winter and you're good for that next year. You might want to keep reapplying year after year just to make sure that it doesn't come back. The most important thing is you don't want to spray it on the leaves because it'll cause the leaves to fall off. And that's why you're spraying in the winter months. But leaf curl is something you can see. It's not going to be an issue if you have it for 1 year, but if you have it for a lot of years, it'll eventually lead to death in the tree. And so this could have been one of the reasons why the tips of those branches were falling off. If you had leaf curl, it could lead to death of those branches. The next one is peach scab. And if any of you have had peaches from an orchard where you picked your own, you might have seen this before. It's a disease that you get on your peaches, and it causes this kind of speckled look of them. Now, insects can do this too. The difference is when you have an insect, the peach will kind of shoot out this sugary gel, and so you'll know that something is fed on it. With peach scab, they don't have that. And this is something that your peaches will eventually rot and fall off the tree. So if it gets really bad, we'll want to treat your peaches. You can do that with Captain, sulfur, or chloranthanil. They're all fungicides. Sulfur is going to be organic if you want to spray organic. And you'll have to spray once a week for 4 weeks after petal fall. So this is, again, if you remember back to the fertilization slides, that's when you're going to want to do it when the petals have fallen off. You'll spray once a week. If your peach tree doesn't ripen until the end of, say, July or August, you might have to reapply every 3 weeks after that initial 4 weeks. So this is something that I wouldn't start by spraying. If you have peaches, I wouldn't say, okay, well, I need to spray every 4 weeks or once a week for 4 weeks. I would wait to see if you actually have the scab first, and then the next year come back and spray if you need to. Because like I said, this is a lot of spraying, but also it can get costly if you have a lot of trees or if you're spraying. And what you want to do is just spray the fruit itself. And that'll make sure that you get good coverage with those fungicides. The last disease is brown rot. And this is something that's going to be an issue during wet weather when your peaches are close to maturing. So those last 3 or 4 weeks before the peaches mature, if you have a lot of rain and humidity in the forecast, then you might want to treat for brown rot. Now, the fungicides you can spray are Captain or sulfur. It's going to be 3 weeks before harvest. If you spray sulfur, it has to be once a week because it doesn't work quite as well as Captain, which is just a fungicide. And you'll be spraying that probably twice during that 3 week period. Now, I've talked a lot about diseases, and for most of them, the only things that you can do are spray. There's not a lot that you can do because the fungus kind of just come and go. But for brown rot, there are some cultural things you can do, and really you should be doing. So any peaches that fall on the ground whether it's at harvest, before, after, whatever. Make sure you get rid of those because they're a place for diseases and insects to kind of get a hold of your peach plants. Also, if there's any fruit that are rotting on the tree or if they have insects on them, get rid of those. And that should reduce your brown rot and some of your insect problems. So we talked about 3 diseases. The next thing we're going to talk about are insects. I only really want to focus on one because I think most of your other insects are going to cause damage to maybe 3 or 4 peaches, maybe a dozen, but it's not going to be a huge issue. These insects, the borers, are ones that can kill entire trees, so you have to be on the lookout for those. Now, the main culprits are going to be your peach tree borers and your lesser peach tree borer. They damage at the base of the tree, so right around where it meets the dirt. The best thing that you can do to try to prevent these is have a healthy tree. Make sure you're pruning properly. Make sure there's no weeds around the base of your tree, that sort of thing. The other borers that you might get are shot hole borers and ambrosia beetles. These feed higher up on the tree, usually around branches, and they can cause branches to die off. So this might be another thing that caused the one person's tree branches to fall off. Again, with these, just want to make sure that you keep a clean area. If you're pruning, make sure you remove that pruned wood. That's very important. And also make sure that you're pruning in the winter months. So if you prune now, your trees are going to produce a pheromone, some sort of alcohol that they put off. Those beetles can sense that and they'll attack your tree. So you want to make sure you do that. If you have a peach tree that dies, go ahead and remove it. Don't leave it in the ground because it's just more habitat for those insects. If you suspect that you have borers, there's limited insecticides that can help you. But if you think you have them, let me know and I'll come out and try to help you deal with these borers, or send me a picture because they can be difficult to deal with. But that's really all we have for our peach tree guide to the backyard. We've got a lot of resources, so take a look at those. If you have any questions, type them down in the chat now. I'll try to answer them, or shoot me an email if you're watching this recorded. Also, while we still have you, make sure that you fill out our evaluation. Lets us know if you like what we're doing. If you have any suggestions, it shouldn't take long. It's, I think, 5 or 6 questions. But we definitely appreciate y'all watching and supporting us and letting us know what we're doing. It doesn't look like I have any more questions now. So that's really all we have for today. Make sure that you tune in tomorrow at 11:30, where Olivia will be doing desk yoga. And that's something that's a great way to get rid of stress, but to stay active, especially now that some of us are going back to work, or if you're still working at home. Desk yoga is something that's great, and we'll be doing that tomorrow at 11:30 with Olivia. So make sure you stay tuned from live from Currituck Extension.